Question 1. Engagement activity. Stereotype threat. Do negative stereotypes affect intelligence testing? This excerpt introduces the concept of stereotype threat, which states that the performances of members of a stereotyped group will conform to negative stereotypes. Members of such a group may be preoccupied by a concern that their performance will perpetuate a negative stereotype. Unfortunately, this concern seems to disrupt their concentration and ability to perform to the level of their true abilities. Steele and Aronson developed an experiment to examine how negative stereotypes about African Americans' level of intelligence affected performance on a test of verbal abilities. Read the excerpts from Steele and Aronson's article, and answer the questions that follow. Question 1. Excerpt Stereotype Threat and the Intellectual Test Performance of African Americans. Introduction. Not long ago, in explaining his career-long preoccupation with the American Jewish experience, the novelist Philip Roth said that it was not Jewish culture or religion per se that fascinated him. It was what he called the Jewish predicament. This is an apt term for the perspective taken in the present research. It focuses on a social psychological predicament that can arise from widely known negative stereotypes about one's group. It is this: the existence of such a stereotype means that anything one does or any of one's features that conform to it make the stereotype more plausible as a self-characterization in the eyes of others, and perhaps even in one's own eyes. We call this predicament stereotype threat and argue that it is experienced, essentially, as a self-evaluative threat. The present research examined the role these processes play in the intellectual test performance of African Americans. Our reasoning is this: whenever African American students perform an explicitly scholastic or intellectual task, they face the threat of confirming or being judged by a negative societal stereotype, a suspicion, about their group's intellectual ability and competence. This threat is not borne by people not stereotyped in this way, and the self-threat it causes, through a variety of mechanisms, may interfere with the intellectual functioning of these students, particularly during standardized tests. Methods. Accordingly, black and white university students in this experiment were given a 30-minute test composed of items from the verbal graduate record examination, GRE, that were difficult enough to be at the limits of most participants' skills. In the stereotype threat condition, the test was described as diagnostic of intellectual ability, thus making the racial stereotype about intellectual ability relevant to black participants' performance and establishing for them the threat of fulfilling it. In the non-stereotype threat condition, the same test was described simply as a laboratory's problem-solving task that was non-diagnostic of ability. Presumably, this would make the racial stereotype about ability irrelevant to black participants' performance and thus preempt any threat of fulfilling it. We recruited 117 male and female black and white Stanford undergraduates through campus advertisements which offered $10 R$130 for 1 hour of participation. The data from 3 participants were excluded from the analysis because they failed to provide their verbal SAT scores. This left a total of 114 participants randomly assigned to the 3 experimental conditions, with the exception that we ensured an equal number of participants per condition. The primary dependent measure was participants' performance on 30 verbal items, 27 of which were difficult items taken from GRE study guides. Only 30% of earlier samples had got these items correct, and 3 difficult anagram problems. Both the total number correct and an accuracy index of the number correct over the number attempted were analyzed. Results in discussion table 1. Performance on the test scaled by verbal SAT scores: diagnostic black 8.6, white 11.8, non-diagnostic black 12.2, white 12.5, with SAT differences statistically controlled. Black participants performed worse than white participants when the test was presented as a measure of their ability, but improved dramatically, matching the performance of whites, when the test was presented as less reflective of ability. The existence of a negative stereotype about a group to which one belongs, we have argued, means that in situations where the stereotype is applicable, one is at risk of confirming it as a self-characterization, both to oneself and to others who know the stereotype. This is what is meant by stereotype threat, and when the stereotype involved demeans something as important as intellectual ability, this threat can be disruptive enough, we hypothesize, to impair intellectual performance. Question 1a. What was the primary difference between the control and experimental groups in this experiment? A. The members of the control and experimental groups received different versions of the test. B. The experimental group was told that the test measured intellectual ability, whereas the control group was not. C. The experimental group read about different kinds of stereotypes before attempting the test. D. The control group consisted of members of one race, and the experimental group consisted of members of a different race. It's B. The experimental group was told that the test measured intellectual ability, whereas the control group was not. Explanation. Steele and Aronson wanted to examine how internalized negative stereotypes affect performance on standardized tests. To do so, they manipulated the alleged purpose of the test to activate negative stereotypes of African Americans. The control group was told that the test was difficult but did not reflect their intellectual abilities. The experimental group, on the other hand, was told that the test measured their intellect. There is a negative stereotype that African Americans have less intellectual ability than Caucasians. This negative stereotype was activated in the experimental group but not in the control group. The test itself, along with the testing procedures, did not vary between the groups. Question 1b. Which of the following best describes the results of the experiment? A. Whites scored significantly higher than blacks in both conditions but by a wider margin in the experimental condition. B. Blacks and whites in the control condition performed similarly, but blacks performed much lower in the experimental condition. C. Blacks performed better than whites in the experimental condition but worse in the control condition. D. All participants in the experimental condition performed significantly worse than their counterparts in the control condition. It's B. Blacks and whites in the control condition performed similarly, but blacks performed much lower in the experimental condition. Explanation. The performance of black and white participants in the control condition was statistically equivalent. In the absence of stereotype threat, both groups had, on average, similar levels of verbal ability. When the test was described as a measure of intelligence, a domain in which black people are negatively stereotyped, the performance of the black participants suffered more than that of white participants. Again, the test wasn't differing between the conditions. The only difference was what the participants thought it measured, and this was enough to drive down the scores of the black participants. Question 1c. What implications does this study have on how psychologists view intelligence testing? A. When intelligence tests are administered to racial minorities, they should be tested separately from people of other races. B. Designing culture-free intelligence tests can alleviate the discrepancy in the scores. C. Simply knowing that intelligence is being tested can impair performance, leading to inaccurate measurements. It's C. Simply knowing that intelligence is being tested can impair performance, leading to inaccurate measurements. Explanation. The results of this experiment should call into question the procedures used when administering intelligence tests. There is a possibility that test takers will conform to negative stereotypes, leading to lower scores that don't accurately reflect a person's abilities. Because factors other than intelligence can impact performance, scores on such tests should be interpreted cautiously. Question 2a. All psychological tests, including various kinds of intelligence tests, are evaluated extensively to ensure their quality. There are disagreements within the field regarding how certain tests are used, but there is widespread agreement on the characteristics of a good test. The first requirement is that the test have a high degree of reliability. Which of the following is one way to determine the reliability of an intelligence test? A. Compare the performance of two randomly selected test takers. B. Compare how the same person performs at two different points in time. C. Compare the performance of different cultural and racial groups to check for bias. It's B. Compare how the same person performs at two different points in time. Explanation. Reliability refers to the consistency of scores or measures. This means that aside from some minor variation, your score on an intelligence test should be relatively stable over time. This assumes that nothing happens that would affect your performance on such a test, such as suffering a brain injury or developing a psychological disorder. It also means that two people who actually have the same level of intelligence should score similarly, assuming that the test is valid. Reliability is ensured by making comparisons to an established baseline level of performance. For instance, you might use one version of the test as a baseline and compare how performance changes if a slightly different, but equivalent, version is used. Ideally, scores on both tests should be highly correlated. If a test is unreliable, you won't be able to interpret anyone's performance on it, partly because you won't know which score is more accurate. Question 2b. In addition to reliability, a good psychological test will also have a high degree of validity. One way of determining the validity of an intelligence test is to measure how well it correlates with academic performance or average test scores. What should a researcher keep in mind when examining this correlation? A. There is probably very little, if any, connection between intelligence and ATS. B. Factors like self-discipline can affect a person's ATS but not his or her intelligence. C. Having a high correlation between those items just means that the person is good at taking tests. It's B. Factors like self-discipline can affect a person's ATS but not his or her intelligence. Explanation. Intelligence tests are often used to identify students who may need educational assistance. Intelligence scores, therefore, should reflect some aspects of educational performance. Generally, there is a highly positive correlation between intelligence scores and ATS. Students with higher scores tend to get higher grades. ATS, however, is dependent on factors other than intelligence. For example, an intelligent student with low self-discipline may not bother studying or completing homework, leading to a lower than expected ATS. Question 1c. There are several specific forms of validity that can be applied to psychological testing. Three of the primary forms are content, criterion-related, and construct validity. The following scenarios describe an invalid test. Use the drop-down menus to select the type of validity that is violated for each scenario. Scenario 1. At the beginning of the semester, a biology lecturer tells her students that they're responsible for knowing only the information presented in class. Half of the first exam covers material assigned in the textbook but never presented in class. In this case, which validity has been violated? Content, criterion-related or construct? It's content validity. Explanation. This is a violation of content validity. The purpose of the exam is to measure how well a student knows the information he or she is responsible for learning. In this case, the lecturer was clear about what information the student should know. The test she constructed, however, did not correspond to what a student should know. The content of the test does not accurately represent the relevant material. Scenario 2. Anil is a psychologist at a school for at-risk students. Part of her job requires her to identify students who struggle with aggressive impulses. Since many students are unwilling to sit through long questionnaires, she tries to design something shorter. Unfortunately, the shorter questionnaire doesn't help in predicting which students will have behavioral problems. Some of the students who scored low on the questionnaire are frequently disciplined for their actions, while some who scored high are not. In this case, which validity has been violated? It's criterion-related validity. Explanation. This is a violation of criterion-related validity. The scores on the questionnaire are unrelated to the student's actual behavior. The student's behavioral records serve as the independent criterion against which the test is measured. The third type of validity is construct validity. This is the extent to which a test measures a hypothetical construct. This is often assessed by looking at how well test scores correlate with other measures of the construct. For example, a test that accurately measures aggression should correlate positively with tests that measure hostility, acceptance of violence, and prevalence of anger, while having a negative correlation with measures of emotional control. Question 3a. In the late 19th century, Sir Francis Galton first expressed the concept of intelligence as a measurable human trait. His efforts to measure it, however, failed to generate support. Modern forms of intelligence testing first appeared in early 20th century France, and several pioneers in the field have made significant contributions. When Louis Taman developed the Stanford Binet test, what addition did he make to intelligence testing? A. He eliminated the concept of mental age. B. He developed an intelligence test that could be taken by adults. C. He ignored Binet's work and developed a completely new test. D. He implemented a new scoring system that included a child's chronological age. It's D. He implemented a new scoring system that included a child's chronological age. Explanation. Taman and colleagues revised Binet's test and incorporated the intelligence quotient IQ calculation. This score accounted for a child's chronological age and made it possible to objectively compare children of different ages by placing them all on the same scale. Question 3b. Historically, a child's mental abilities have been expressed as an intelligence quotient IQ. Tabo takes a version of the Stanford Binet intelligence test. His IQ is calculated to be 78. If his mental age is 7, then what is his chronological age? He's be 9 years old. IQ is calculated using the following formula. IQ equals mental age divided by chronological age 100. This formula can be converted to find the chronological age. Chronological age equals mental age 100. IQ equals 7 times 100 divided 78 equals 9. Rounded to nearest whole number. Question 3D. In the 1980s, developers of IQ tests began to distinguish between different types of intelligence to provide more detailed information for the meaning behind a person's intelligence quotient. Psychologists recognize many subtypes of intelligence, but the distinction between fluid and crystallized intelligence was one of the first to be made. The following is an example of how researchers may measure one of these two types of intelligence. You are going to be shown 5 sets of a series of numbers. After seeing all the sets of numbers, you will be tasked with writing down as many numbers as you can. This scenario illustrates a type of test that is intended to measure what kind of intelligence? Explanation. Fluid intelligence involves the ability to solve problems independent of acquired knowledge. Fluid intelligence includes one's reasoning abilities, memory capacity, and speed of information processing. Whereas crystallized intelligence involves the ability to solve problems or answer questions based on acquired knowledge and skills from past experience. For the given scenario, a person's acquired knowledge is not necessary to solve the problem. Rather, the task is intended to measure a person's reasoning abilities. Question 4a. The most widely used adult intelligence test is the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. 3rd edition weighs 3. It is scored by comparing a person's performance to the normal distribution of scores. Which of the following is true about this distribution? A. The most prevalent single score is 110. B. Most of the population has an above average IQ. C. Less than 5% of people score above 130 or below 70. D. There are more people towards the extremely high end than towards the extremely low end. It's C. Less than 5% of people score above 130 or below 70. Explanation. With a normal distribution of scores, there are equal numbers of people above and below the average. In fact, the distribution of scores above the average mirrors the distribution of scores below it. For intelligence tests, the average score is 100. About 68% of people achieve scores within one standard deviation of the average between 85 and 115 for intelligence tests. Scores occur less and less frequently as you move towards either extreme, with less than 5% of people scoring above 130 or below 70. Question 4b. Tabo takes an intelligence test and receives a score of 78. Use the distributions tool to answer the questions that follow. You'll need to set the mean to the appropriate value for an IQ distribution. Then, select the radio button with the orange line, and position the line at the appropriate score. Thabo's intelligence score is lower than what percent of the population? Thabo's intelligence score is lower than 92.92% of the population. Explanation. Modern intelligence tests are standardized to a normal distribution, and scores are based on how well a person performs in comparison to the overall population. Thabo's score of 78 means that 7.08% of the population scored lower than him and 92.92% scored higher. Question 4c. Tabo is likely to be classified as what based on his IQ score? Tabo is likely to be classified as below average based on his IQ score. Explanation. Psychologists involved in intelligence testing assume that IQ scores are normally distributed throughout the population with a mean of 100 and a standard deviation of 15. Most people, 68.26%, have an intelligence score within one standard deviation of the mean, 85-115, and this is considered the average range. The categories include gifted, IQ above 130, 2.2% of people, superior, IQ between 116-130, 13.6% of people, average, IQ between 86-115, 68.26% of people, below average, IQ between 70-85, 13.6% of people, retarded, IQ below 70, 2.2% of people. Question 5 A and B engagement activity. Savant syndrome. Savant syndrome. People with savant syndrome can have an extraordinary ability that is very specific and highly limited. What is remarkable is that these people often have severe limitations in other kinds of mental processing. George Finn, the man featured in this video, is such a person. To begin, press the arrow below the black screen to start the video. After viewing the video, answer the following questions. Which of the following are things Mr. Finn is capable of doing? A. Recalling with great detail the first time he heard any piece of music. B. Recreating a drawing or painting from memory after seeing for less than a minute. C. Telling you the day, Friday of any date in history, the 5th of March, 1982. D. Reciting pi out to 500 decimal places. And what is Mr. Finn not capable of doing? A. Remembering people he has met. B. Simple multiplication, such as 3 times 5. C. Living on his own. D. Holding down a job. Mr. Finn is capable of C. Telling you the day, Friday of any date in history, the 5th of March, 1982. And what is Mr. Finn not capable of? B. Simple multiplication, such as 3 times 5. Explanation. The case of George Finn illustrates how complicated intelligence is. He clearly excels at certain kinds of thinking, like figuring out the day of the week for any day in history, but he is unable to do some things that most students in grade 5 can. He can remember the weather in New York City for every day of his adult life, suggesting that he has a remarkable memory. Yet, he can't memorize the kinds of multiplication tables that are taught in school, and has difficulty with simple mathematical calculations. Although George used to live in an assisted living facility, he now has a job and lives independently. He has some intellectual impairments but is able to function well in his environment. The case of Mr. Finn supports which of the following conclusions? A. We might have several types of intelligence, with differing levels, instead of one general intellectual ability. B. We probably have a general level of intelligence that underlies all of our cognitive functioning. C. Memory ability is a general function that can be used equally well with all kinds of different information. D. Most people who can do rapid calendar calculations are doing it through a rapid mathematical formula. It's A. We might have several types of intelligence, with differing levels, instead of one general intellectual ability. Explanation. The fact that certain abilities are enhanced while others are diminished, as in Mr. Finn's case, suggests that these mental abilities are separate from one another. Howard Gardner, a psychologist at Harvard University, used cases of savant syndrome to support his view that people have multiple intelligences. His reasoning is based on the idea that these cases allowed researchers to observe different forms of intelligence in isolation. If intelligence is a generalized level of functioning, then all of Mr. Finn's cognitive abilities should operate similarly. Instead, Mr. Finn has some abilities that are exceptional. It is important to note that individuals with savant syndrome display a wide range of impressive abilities, not just calendar calculation. Some savants can recreate a painting or piece of music they've only encountered a single time. Others can do amazing feats of mental mathematics, whereas others have memorized the different postal codes and telephone prefixes for the entire country. Critics of Dr. Gardner agree that these cases suggest that cognitive abilities can be separated, but they do not believe that this is a strong argument for the idea of multiple intelligences. Their primary criticism is that many of Gardner's classifications, such as musical intelligence and bodily kinesthetic intelligence, should be referred to as talents instead of intelligences. Others have pointed out that there is no empirically valid way of testing the levels of the different intelligences that Gardner describes. Still others have pointed out that many of Gardner's intelligences are correlated with one another. If you score highly on a test of verbal intelligence, you will probably score highly on other kinds of intelligence tests as well. Dr. Gardner doesn't dispute the notion of a generalized intellectual capacity but defends his theory by stating that he wants to understand the mind as a whole and the different ways that people think. Question 6a. Nature and nurture of intelligence. The following graph shows the degree of correlation between various relatives' intelligence scores. Longer bars indicate higher correlations. Looking at the graph, which of the following relationships has the highest correlation? A. Fraternal twins raised together. B. Siblings raised together. C. Identical twins raised apart. D. Biological parent and child living apart. Clearly the answer is B, but you know what actually leads to an increase in IQ? This week's sponsor. Raid: Shadow Legends. Trademark Sign is an immersive online experience with everything you'd expect from a brand new RPG title. It's got an amazing storyline, awesome 3D graphics, giant boss fights, PvP battles, and hundreds of never-before-seen champions to collect and customize. I never expected to get this level of performance out of a mobile game. Look how crazy the level of detail is on these champions. Raid: Shadow Legends. Trademark Sign is getting big real fast, so you should definitely get in early. Starting now will give you a huge head start. There's also an upcoming special launch tournament with crazy prizes. And not to mention, this game is absolutely free, so go ahead and check out the video description to find out more about Raid: Shadow Legends. Trademark Sign. There, you will find a link to the store page and a special code to unlock all sorts of goodies. Using the special code Psych102, you can get 50,000 silver immediately, and a free epic level champion as part of the new players program, courtesy of course of the Raid: Shadow Legends. Trademark Sign. Devs. Now back to the question. It's identical twins raised apart. Explanation. Generally, the intelligence correlations increase as the amount of genetic overlap increases. This supports the notion that intelligence is, to some degree, due to genetics. To assess the role that environment plays, researchers examine how intelligence correlations are affected by shared and non-shared environments. Such a comparison might involve comparing identical twins raised together with those raised apart. Within a particular type of relationship, those with more environmental overlap have stronger correlations between their intelligence scores than those who have less environmental overlap. So, identical twins or siblings raised together are more similar than those raised apart, suggesting that environmental factors contribute to intelligence. Question 6b. Which of the following best supports the claim that genetic factors play a role in determining intelligence? A. The correlation is higher for siblings raised together than for siblings raised apart. B. The correlation is lower for cousins than for adoptive siblings. C. The correlation is higher for identical twins than for fraternal twins. D. The correlation is lower for adoptive siblings than for adoptive parents and children. It's C. The correlation is higher for identical twins than for fraternal twins. Explanation. If genetic factors play a role in determining intelligence, then relatives with greater genetic overlap should have more highly correlated intelligence scores. This can be seen by comparing identical and fraternal twins. Identical twins have greater genetic overlap and a higher correlation of intelligence scores. Question 6c. A large heritability ratio means A. Relatives are likely to be similar in both appearance and behavior. B. A trait is more dependent on genetic, rather than environmental factors. C. Adoptive parents have more impact on a child's traits than biological parents. D. Most of a person's traits are inherited from his or her biological parents. It's B. A trait is more dependent on genetic, rather than environmental factors. Explanation. The heritability ratio describes how much variability of a particular trait within a population can be attributed to genetic factors. When researchers say that height has a heritability ratio of 90%, this means that, on average, height is more dependent on genetic factors than environmental ones. The heritability ratio, however, cannot be used to estimate a particular individual's traits. It can only describe a general pattern observed within the population at large. For example, height is heavily dependent on genetics, but a child with tall parents may be short if he or she is seriously malnourished. With intelligence, the heritability ratio is thought to be about 50%. It's important to remember that the heritability ratio describes the relative importance of genetic and environmental factors for a particular trait. Question 6d. Which of the following pieces of evidence supports early intervention for children who are born into extremely deprived situations? A. Comparisons across generations show that IQ is gradually increasing overall. B. Children who live in poverty have lower IQ scores initially but show the same pattern of development and improvement as well-off counterparts. C. Children removed from orphanages show gains in IQ, whereas those who are not adopted show continued declines. D. The difference in IQ between wealthy and poor students remains constant throughout childhood. It's C. Children removed from orphanages show gains in IQ, whereas those who are not adopted show continued declines. Explanation. The cumulative deprivation hypothesis is based on the observation that a child's environment can impact the development of his or her IQ. Persistent deprivation has effects that build up over time. The longer a person remains in an academically substandard environment, the greater its effects are. Pulling children out of this environment and placing them into an academically beneficial one often produces significant gains in IQ. Question 7a. Engagement activity. Cross-cultural intelligence testing. How do other cultures and countries define intelligence? Many concepts within psychology are defined in ethnocentric ways. Intelligence is one of these concepts. Many researchers have found significant cross-cultural differences in how intelligence is viewed. This has implications for how individuals within these cultures are educated and the factors that contribute to a person's success. This type of research also has implications for how other cross-cultural studies are conducted. Read this excerpt and answer the following questions. Question 7a. Excerpts. Intelligence across cultures. In recent years, researchers in Africa, Asia and elsewhere have found that people in non-Western cultures often have ideas about intelligence that differ fundamentally from those that have shaped Western intelligence tests. Research on those differences is already providing support for some of the more inclusive Western definitions of intelligence, such as those proposed by APA President Robert J. Sternberg, Ph.D., of Yale University and Howard Gardner, Ph.D., of Harvard University's Graduate School of Education. Eventually, it may also help researchers design new intelligence tests that are sensitive to the values of the cultures in which they are used. Some cultural differences in intelligence play out on a global scale. In The Geography of Thought, Free Press, 2003, Richard Nisbett, Ph.D., co-director of the Culture and Cognition program at the University of Michigan, argues that East Asian and Western cultures have developed cognitive styles that differ in fundamental ways, including in how intelligence is understood. People in Western cultures, he suggests, tend to view intelligence as a means for individuals to devise categories and to engage in rational debate, while people in Eastern cultures see it as a way for members of a community to recognize contradiction and complexity and to play their social roles successfully. Other researchers have come to similar conclusions. In a study published in Intelligence Volume 25, Number 1, Sternberg and Shi-Yin Yang, Ph.D., of National Kainan University in Taiwan, found that Taiwanese, Chinese conceptions of intelligence emphasize understanding and relating to others, including knowing when to show and when not to show one's intelligence. Such differences between Eastern and Western views of intelligence are tied, says Nisbett, to differences in the basic cognitive processes of people in Eastern and Western cultures. University of California, Berkeley, psychologist Kaiping Peng, Ph.D., who has collaborated with Nisbett on a number of studies, also believes that there are differences between the cognitive styles of people raised in Eastern and Western cultures. But, like Nisbett, he cautions against the simplistic idea that everyone raised in a particular culture will share equally in that culture's style of thinking, or that someone raised in one culture will be unable to learn the cognitive style of another. I don't believe that simply because you are born Asian means you will think like Asians, says Penn. Culture is not just race, nationality or any particular social category. Culture is experience. The distinction between East Asia and the West is only one of many cultural distinctions that separate different ways of thinking about intelligence. Robert Sapel, Ph.D., who is returning this year to the University of Zambia after 13 years at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, has studied concepts of intelligence in rural African communities since the 1970s. Sapel and others have found that people in some African communities, especially where Western schooling has not yet become common, tend to blur the Western distinction between intelligence and social competence. In rural Zambia, for instance, the concept of Nzelo includes both cleverness, chenjula, and responsibility. To Makila, when rural parents in Africa talk about the intelligence of children, they prefer not to separate the cognitive speed aspects of intelligence from the social responsibility aspect, says Sapel. Over the past several years, Sternberg and Grigorenko also have investigated concepts of intelligence in Africa. Among the Luo people in rural Kenya, Grigorenko and her collaborators have found that ideas about intelligence consist of four broad concepts: RICO, which largely corresponds to the Western idea of academic intelligence, but also includes specific skills. LAURO, which includes social qualities like respect, responsibility and consideration. PERO, or practical thinking. And WINJO, or comprehension. Only one of the four, RICO, is correlated with traditional Western measures of intelligence. In another study in the same community, Sternberg and his collaborators found that children who score highly on a test of knowledge about medicinal herbs, a measure of practical intelligence, tend to score poorly on tests of academic intelligence. The results, published in the Intelligence Volume 29, Number 5, suggest that practical and academic intelligence can develop independently or even in conflict with each other, and that the values of a culture may shape the direction in which a child develops. They also agree with studies in a number of countries, both industrialized and non-industrialized, that suggest that people who are unable to solve complex problems in the abstract can often solve them when they are presented in a familiar context. The end result of this research is twofold. As Sternberg has pointed out, lay theories of intelligence often lack the precision of scientific theories, but they can suggest new avenues of research, shed light on how people use intelligence in everyday life and highlight aspects of intelligence that scientific theories have ignored. Studying intelligence in different cultures can thus be a way of challenging conventional Western ideas about intelligence. Research in non-Western cultures can also be directly useful to people in those cultures. It indicates the extent to which Western intelligence tests measure what those cultures are interested in measuring, and it may suggest alternative, culturally appropriate methods of assessing skills and abilities. Question 7a. Although there is a great deal of individual variation, which of the following generally describes the difference between East Asian and Western views of intelligence? A. The Western view includes a much broader range of cognitive abilities than the East Asian view. B. The Western view is based heavily on verbal ability, while the East Asian view is based more on spatial and mathematical ability. C. The Western view states that intelligence can be measured, while the East Asian view states that it cannot. D. The Western view emphasizes rational thought, while the East Asian view emphasizes social understanding. It's D. The Western view emphasizes rational thought, while the East Asian view emphasizes social understanding. Explanation. The differences in how cultures view intelligence mirror some larger, more general cultural differences. Eastern cultures tend to be more collective, emphasizing social harmony, respect for elders, and conforming to specified social norms. Such cultures tend to view intelligence as reflecting one's ability to understand and behave in accordance with these social rules. Western cultures tend to be more individualistic, viewing intelligence as a set of abilities that can be expressed in isolation. Question 7b. Which of the following describes how some rural African societies view intelligence? A. It is based mostly on intuitive, rather than academic, knowledge. B. It is highly similar to Western views of intelligence. C. It disregards cognitive abilities and focuses instead on social competence. D. It includes cognitive, social, and practical abilities. It's D. It includes cognitive, social, and practical abilities. Explanation. In rural Africa, intelligence can be described as a blend of different domains of knowledge and abilities. In some villages, intelligence consists of cognitive skills, social competence, and practical behavior. In others, it consists of these items plus understanding of the natural world. As the article points out, in Western societies, there is a tendency to break intelligence down into separate skills, such as verbal versus spatial abilities. In rural African societies, the different parts of intelligence are separable. Question 7c. What implications do the research findings described in the article have for our understanding of psychological functioning? A. Cross-cultural differences in thinking may be driven by cultural values, rather than qualities innate to individuals. B. Cross-cultural differences in thinking are often difficult to measure or quantify. C. Cross-cultural comparisons of thinking are generally insensitive and promote disharmony, rather than understanding. It's A. Cross-cultural differences in thinking may be driven by cultural values, rather than qualities innate to individuals. Explanation. The findings of intelligence researchers can be applied more generally to researchers investigating other forms of thinking. People have a tendency to view cognitive functioning as reflecting individual ability, but this research suggests that certain cultural values or emphases can impact the types of skills people develop. For example, some theories of decision-making are based on achieving the maximum benefit. Individuals raised in more collectivist cultures, however, may consider an entirely different set of factors and have different goals, leading to decisions that are classified as being irrational. Question 8a. Interactions between hereditary and environmental factors. Cultural differences in IQ scores are a fairly common finding. What is the source of most of the controversy around cultural differences in IQ? A. Many people don't want to acknowledge that some ethnic groups don't show the full range of IQ scores. B. The shrinking gap between students in South Africa and foreign students has worried some politicians. C. People are trying to determine whether the cultural gap is due to genetic or environmental factors. D. Most researchers don't want to acknowledge that such differences exist. It's C. People are trying to determine whether the cultural gap is due to genetic or environmental factors. Explanation. Although cultural differences are well documented, researchers often disagree on the causes and significance of these findings. The gap between the scores of white and black students has been shrinking, but it still persists. Many psychologists don't know what to attribute this difference to. Some have argued that this reflects genetic differences, similar to the way that males and females exhibit different physical abilities. Others have argued that the gap is rooted in social differences, such as culture and socioeconomic status. One of the major difficulties in this field of research is trying to separate the genetic and social effects to determine how much each contributes to the development of intelligence. Question 8b. Which of the following best describes the reasoning behind Leon Kamen's analogy of seed and soil? A. IQ scores cannot be genetically based, because most of the evidence suggests otherwise. B. The tests that are used to measure IQ are often culturally biased and don't accurately reflect intelligence. C. Even if IQ scores are due mainly to genetics, environmental effects can produce significant differences among races. It's C. Even if IQ scores are due mainly to genetics, environmental effects can produce significant differences among races. Explanation. Leon Kamen's analogy argues that what appear to be genetic differences might be due entirely to environmental factors. Genetic differences account for the range of scores seen within each population, but the environmental factors produce the overall difference in average performance. On a basic level, he argues that heritability and environmental effects cannot be easily separated. Question 8c. Which of the following is not a disadvantage that children from lower socioeconomic status experience? A. Poorer quality schools. B. Reduced access to educational television programs. C. Less pressure to succeed academically. It's B. Reduced access to educational television programs. Explanation. Children from lower socioeconomic classes have several disadvantages that work against the development of intelligence, and minority groups are largely overrepresented in the lower social classes. These disadvantages can be characterized globally as reduced access to quality education and decreased emphasis on academic achievement. There may be less incentive or support for intellectual development, possibly contributing to lower IQ scores. That class differences in IQ can be as large as ethnic differences suggests that the learning environment may play a significant role in how intelligence develops. Even when studies focus on whites exclusively, differences in social class are found to impact IQ scores, with white children from lower socioeconomic classes having lower IQ scores than white children from high socioeconomic classes. Unfortunately, researchers can't make definitive statements about how environment and genetics interact. The problem with relying on these observations is that they are correlations, limiting the types of conclusions that can be drawn. Question 9a. New directions in intelligence. The usefulness of intelligence tests has been hotly debated within psychology. Some psychologists have called for alternative measures of intelligence. Others have attempted to define intelligence based on the different ways that information can be used, rather than focusing primarily on cognitive skills. In recent years, several intelligence researchers have tried to determine if any biological correlates of intelligence exist. Brain size and volume both show modest positive correlations with intelligence. Why should you be cautious about drawing conclusions from this data? A. This research has only been conducted on animals, not humans. B. It's not clear which variable is the cause and which is the effect. C. Brain volume is not affected by environment, but intelligence is. D. Brain volume cannot be accurately measured with currently available technology. It's B. It's not clear which variable is the cause and which is the effect. Explanation. Several potential biological correlates have been proposed. This research was motivated by a desire to develop an unbiased measure of intelligence. IQ can vary greatly across cultures, and some of this variation can be attributed to asking a biased set of questions. If a biological measurement could be found, this might eliminate potential sources of bias, resulting in more accurate measurements of intelligence. To date, however, the proposed measurements only have a modest correlation with intelligence. Correlations would need to be much higher for these measurements to be useful. Even if that point is reached, you're still left with the question of what causes differences in intelligence. Because correlations don't imply causation, you may know that brain volume and size go hand in hand with intelligence, but you don't know if larger volume leads to higher intelligence or if the process of increasing your intelligence causes your brain to grow. Question 9b. Sternberg's triarchic theory of intelligence is another contemporary approach to defining and understanding intelligence. According to Sternberg, which of the following is an example of practical intelligence? A. Being able to achieve good marks in school. B. Impressing your lecturers with your new approaches to solving familiar problems. C. Finding out what your boss's expectations are when you begin a new job. D. Quickly breaking down a new situation to determine the best course of action. It's C. Finding out what your boss's expectations are when you begin a new job. Explanation. Sternberg viewed intelligence and cognition as a series of interconnected parts. Each part is separate, but they all work together to produce intelligence. He called this a triarchic theory, because it consisted of three subtheories. Contextual subtheory specifies how intelligence should be defined for a particular culture. Experimental subtheory specifies how an intelligent person should behave. Two key behaviors are the ability to effectively deal with novel situations and the ability to do familiar tasks without much effort. Componential subtheory specifies the mental processes that form the basis of intelligence. These can be divided into knowledge acquisition components, metacomponents, and performance components. In recent years, his theory has been extended by proposing three distinct forms of intelligence. Practical intelligence, being able to effectively manage and meet everyday challenges, includes the ability to work efficiently, understand what is required of you, relate to others, and act in appropriate ways. Creative intelligence, being able to develop new ideas and try new approaches, solving problems through insight. Analytical intelligence, the type of intelligence captured by most IQ tests, includes verbal, spatial, reasoning, and judgment abilities. Question 9c. Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences currently lists 9 different forms of intelligence, although more may be included in the future. The table below lists 3 examples of how different forms of intelligence might be displayed. Choose the type of intelligence that is represented by each example given. Example: intelligence. Jenna is a scientist and uses her reasoning skills to derive interesting, novel predictions from existing data. Most of her investigations start by saying, if A, B, and C are true, then D must also be true. Therefore, I need to design a study to examine D. A golfer has a highly developed muscle memory and is able to replicate the actions of a swing repeatedly with little variation. The first thing everyone says about Andre is that he is articulate. He seems to have a gift for communicating in a way that is both intelligent and relatable. Gardner's theory includes the following types of intelligence. Description intelligence, approaching problems in an analytical manner, understanding mathematical patterns and principles, using long chains of reasoning. Logical mathematical, expressing yourself clearly, understanding the mechanics and functions of language, using language effectively. Linguistic, understanding the mechanics of melody, rhythm, and tone, composing, performing, analyzing, and appreciating music. Musical, recognizing and manipulating patterns of space, performing spatial transformations. Spatial, controlling the parts of your body, making precise or complex movements. Bodily kinesthetic, responding effectively to the moods, needs, and desires of others, understanding motivation and intentions of others. Interpersonal, understanding your own desires, motivations, needs, and emotions, knowing your strengths and weaknesses, using knowledge of yourself to make effective decisions. Intrapersonal, recognizing and understanding natural processes, categorizing objects in nature, having insight into how the natural world works. Naturalist, conceptualizing questions related to human existence, seeking higher truths, pondering questions of life, death, and spirituality. Existential. This is the end of chapter 9 Mindtap.